Welcome to Minority Trip Report. MTR is a podcast spotlighting stories of personal transformation and underrepresented leaders in mental health, psychedelics, and consciousness. I'm your host, Raj Siraj. If you're learning from or enjoying Minority Trip Report, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. Thank you and enjoy the episode. Today, my guest is Kris Archie, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Circle and Philanthropy, as well as a mother, auntie, and engaged community member. Kris is a questioner, a lover of good coffee, great food, and conversations about what matters. She works to bring folks together for a deeper understanding and connection. Kris, welcome. It's been a long time in the making. Thanks for making time.
Yes, it has been. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm super delighted to be in conversation with you today.
Amazing. We have so many things to talk about, and I'm so excited to cover all the grounds, all the different topics. You know, I first experienced your work and the way you actually facilitate in the community and the way you usher community, I think about almost 3 years ago now at Hollyhock. And I was enamored. I think like you have such a spectacular story and your style of leadership is just so inspiring. So I'm really happy that you're here. I think a good place to start is I think, in my experience, I've heard a lot of leaders in the community from First Nations peoples to other Indigenous communities everywhere state not only what it is that they do, but how they fit in their own community, which is a really a beautiful framing. So for you, I read your bio and it said, Kris Archie is the Chief Executive Officer of the Circle and Philanthropy Circle, but it also said you're a mother, auntie, and engaged community member. Now, this is, I think, very specific to, Indigenous way of knowing and doing, and it's something that we're going to talk about. But why is stating your relationships explicitly in this way important for you and for the world to know? What does it say about an Indigenous way of knowing?
I really love this question. No one's ever asked me that before. I mean, so first and foremost, for me, putting information like that in a bio is in some ways it's a demonstration of my resistance to the idea that I am only who I am because of the work I do. I am so much more than the work that I do. And adding in information like the fact that I'm a mother, an auntie, a sister, a community member is indicating that I have accountabilities and relationships that actually have a weight and that bring with me gifts. And I think what that says about Indigenous folks, many folks, I don't want to be like pan-Indigenous in this, but I think many Indigenous folks begin with a sense of orienting who they are with the relationships they hold, because those relationships come with accountabilities and they come with gifts. And I think that's why that was important to me was, I do work. There's this thing that I do that pays me, but there are these other things that I do that actually bring me so much more joy and pleasure. They bring me a sense of contribution to community, and they keep me grounded in what matters. There's nothing more humbling than being a parent and having a kid who's, you're just like the biggest dork ever, or are you actually going to wear that outside of the house? There's nothing more exciting than being an auntie and like hanging out with nieces and nephews and nibblings and just supporting them to be kind of all of who they are in the world. And one of our teachings so I'm Sequem to Gelmoch, and one of our teachings is that you need to be self-sufficient. That's how you are a good community member, is in your ability to be self-sufficient. Can you take care of yourself? Can you feed yourself? Can you keep yourself warm and dressed? Can you get yourself where you need to go on the land? And then after that, it's then once you do those things, you do them for others. And you have a responsibility to pass and transfer that wisdom to others so that we are less Gwen-Gwent, right? In our language, Gwen-Gwent means like pitiful, like deeply. The closest you can get in English to this concept is like deeply pitiful. And that's like an important teaching of, when I'm going to other places, I am so pitiful. I have no idea like where the water and the berries are and what kind of animals are going to jump out and get me. So I think there's that piece as well, is like my naming those is also one of the ways I try and tie back in some of the values I have as a Sequem woman to the relationships that I'm fortunate to have.
That's beautiful. And it's such a different way of thinking, right? And as you were talking about why orienting yourself around the relationships that you have, the other roles that you play in your life. You think it was sort of like the usual professional realm or like Western industrial capitalistic realm, which is sort of like, okay, so this is what I do, and then oh, here's the list of values I believe in. I'm like, if you just say what you're a father, if you're auntie, if you're engaged, it just tells you the shit you care about. You don't have to just then say these are my list of values. Like who gives a shit, right? It's
I mean, I feel like that's that's the other piece too, is like I've never been a fan of first of all, and I know we'll connect a bit about kind of formative years, but I am not someone with a bunch of credentials
mm,
to my
mm,
name, right? I don't have any degrees. I've never won any awards. I'm not on, top 50 under 50 lists. Like none of those things have been part of how I've been in the world in my professional spaces. And so I think that's the other piece is like when I've been asked to write bios, whether it's for work I'm doing or presentations or for websites or whatever, I never had that
mm,
list of
mm,
credentials and letters behind my name. So it gave me a lot of freedom to think about, so who am I and how do I want to be seen in these spaces that are deeply credentialed
mm.
and have a kind of a social norm about how people talk about themselves and present themselves, and they have their like photo and they do the whole thing. And and I'm showing up being like, yeah, I think being flippant about it is a part of my desire to kind of pull back my sense of agency and power to be like, yeah, I don't have those things, but I got something that actually in some ways I consider to be of higher value and of a higher, depth than some letters behind my name. Cause, you don't fuck with moms and aunties.
You certainly don't. You certainly don't. That's a really interesting way of framing it. I hadn't considered that part. I also think, if you ask people sincerely and you peel back enough of the layers and assuming somebody's being authentic, it's really where they're going to go ultimately anyway. I did this exercise last
Mhm,
year and I was sort of like looking at my core values. And of course, it ranges from, the personal to the interpersonal to the macro and so on. But really at the top was family, you know? It was
mhm,
really like what am I scared of and what do I care about the most? It's family, right? It's about I care about my parents, I care about my siblings, my friends, and I think the framing around both accountability, but also a way to capture and be authentic, recapture sort of like how people should see you and then be authentic is a really interesting way of framing it.
even for those folks who may not have a primary value around family, that if they don't have a primary value around family, then they're in the opposite space, which is anything but
Mm,
family
mhm.
because of perhaps the traumas or the
Right.
experiences they've had or because of the teachings they've inherited. So it does, I think, to your point, I think it does always come back to those primary relationships
Relationships,
of
yeah.
like growing
I mean,
up.
and family, of course, it could be birth family or chosen family, right? Ultimately, recognizing who it is that you rely on or want to rely on, aspirationally, even, right?
Mhm.
Did you always feel, talk about your core values and family and your relationships? Did you always have a clear sense of why that is important to you, your place and position in the community, your sense of identity in your community? Was it always evident to you? And I ask this specifically because I find, and this is not to put all minorities on, in the and as I treat them as a monolith or anything like that, and to put them all in the same box. But generally speaking, in my experience, when you have minorities with fragmented lineages, fragmented heritage, fragmented history and story because of colonialism, because of trauma, whatever that might be, it's very clear. It's actually very difficult to have that sense of identity from the beginning. Maybe it's something you grow into because things become clearer, you heal, and
Mhm.
so on. For you, what was the case?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think that it's fluctuated
Mhm.
over time. I grew up as the eldest daughter to a single mom who made the decision very quickly after I was born to move away from our home reserve into the closest town. And in many ways, because she wanted to create a different kind of an environment, and in her her thinking at the time was like, I want to create a sense of safety around my daughter that she didn't necessarily experience as a child herself. So I have all of these like core memories of being surrounded by my aunties and my cousins and my cats, like my grannies, and and having a sense of home and a sense of welcome in those places on reserve, but also feel really, even though I lived like in town, I had always had a clear sense that it doesn't matter if it's not the reserve, this is my territory.
Mm,
These places are my lands. And I have a kind of sense of, you know, clarity about belonging to this place, you know? I think that it shows up in how I walk in the world, to be honest. I think that I learned, definitely from my mom, like I walk with my head held high with a sense of purpose and a sense of I belong here. And I think that was a very unusual thing for people to witness in our town when there was only one other 2 other Native families in town at that time, and only 2 other Native families who went to the school in town. And, and then being biracial, like having a settler dad meant that, I'm lighter skinned than my cousins, so similar to what I've heard in some of your other podcasts, there are many folks who, like myself, have a sense of unsettled belonging. Like, I know I belong, and yet why is it that because of how I look or because of the stories of my lineage, I'm treated differently? I remember it feeling really confusing. I would be in the school and I was bullied really awfully as a child. And then I would go home to the res. And especially once school started, then it was like more difficult for me to feel a sense of connection and belonging to some of my cousins in the kind of
mhm.
in the broader community. But I always had a sense of who I belong to and who I'm accountable to. And I still do. So I feel really fortunate. I think there are so many Indigenous folks globally who don't have a relationship to their lands and a opportunity to have an unbroken connection to their families and their peoples. And so I recognize, even though things might have been difficult and I felt sometimes a sense of being disliked or a sense of being not fully welcomed or a full sense of belonging in these spaces that I was in, I never had a sense that it made me any less of who I am as a Sequoian woman, right? Like, it was just like, no, no, this is who I am and where I belong. So yeah, I think one of the things that I'm kind of coming to terms with now in my life is trying to understand the ways in which I've had to kind of code switch or be a kind of play a role in this like knowledge translation between worlds, between worldviews, and that there's an ease to it, right? There's like the knowledge translation, there's it's a skill set, but I have an ease in that space. And that can be very helpful when I'm dealing with white folks or when I'm dealing with folks who have a curiosity or a desire to understand a little more deeply. But that knowledge translation doesn't necessarily not necessarily seen as a skill set back home in the community. It's almost like a folks can see it as a discomforting thing. Like we don't want a modern interpretation of our ways of caring for children and families to be recorded for
Mm.
legislation. And I'm like, no, no, but like this knowledge translation is deeply essential to the future of our community. And like I wasn't involved in that work, but just as a specific example, where I see folks who play knowledge translation roles between the values that our community has and lives into like contemporary society.
That's a
Going on what you
really
asked, but
actually, it's quite an important thing, a topic to talk about actually, because I've noticed that even in my community, right? In communities that have been impacted again through traumatic events, right? Through the breaking of history and breaking of lineage, there is rightfully and understandably a fear of that same force, being exposed to that same force, which, let's be honest, it still exists in the world today, right? That sort of colonizing force, that sort of dominant. Yeah.
yes, actively.
But on the other hand, it's sort of like not engaging it is also dangerous because it keeps your community, keeps depriving your community, right? For example, realm of technology, right? we can now talk about how technology is being applied, but technology itself can be an enabler of wealth, of prosperity, of skills and so on. How do we do that? And so the question here is, do we need to heal first, or is it a sort of, do we enable the leaders within the community first who can see the frontier?
Oh my gosh, I think it's got to be
Mm,
both and. I think that there's a tension there, but I think that rather than seeing it as something to be, I think what's really helpful, and it's one of the things I find myself deeply committed to, is like how to support people to see it as a that tension and conflict is a creative catalyst, and it's a necessary space to enter into. We deepen relationships when we enter into conflict. We can be more creative when we surface conflict. We actually see more of what matters if we can make conflict
mm,
visible. And I think leaders are required to have skill sets to go into those spaces. And for some people, that means putting your leadership on the line. And for others, they're like, no, thank you. I don't want to rock the boat. I want to follow the rules. I want to do the things. I don't want people to not like me, so I'm just going to kind of do the things. And so I think that, there are these kind of skill sets that are required, but then also healing work. I mean, there's nothing for me in my experience, nothing has required me to do the depth of healing that I've been doing than being in a leadership position in my organization
mm,
and in the sector. Because what comes with leadership is all of this, first of all, this dominant narrative about what leaders look
right.
like and sound like and how they behave and all these norms. And then there is, you know, all of this ego stuff that comes up for me being like this, rebellious, you know, green haired, pierced faced, little shit. I hated the man. I hated the notion of power of institutions to then be like, oh, I'm the man. Like I'm the leader.
Mm,
What does that
mm,
mean? What is my relationship to power? All of these things I had to really deepen into and explore. And then the beauty of the healing work in this time has been, oh, this is a deep invitation to rethink what power and authority look like for me as a Chikwem person. Like, what is my land and my teachings tell me about how I show up and behave and what is expected of me. And so I think in some ways, watching leaders can also be a catalyst for people to notice for themselves their own shadows. And 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 yeah, and so just speaking for myself, the leadership roles that I've been in have kind of pushed me into these spaces of deeper healing that I'm really thankful for, even though they've been deeply
mm.
unsettling. They're not always fun, but they're necessary, and I feel like really glad for that.
Yeah, and as you're talking, it also a friend of mine told me about this idea, and I'm not sure which Native American or indigenous community this came from, but the idea of the twisted hair, right? People who leave the community but then come back with the knowledge from the outside, and their role is to bring back
Mhm.
ideas, bring back other ways of seeing, so that the community can be enabled in different ways. Because I think fear has a weird way of sort of like collapsing the vision of the future, right? And to your point, like, why should we
Yes.
try harder? Because every time we tried, we got fucked. So why should we not choose the
Mhm.
safer route? Absolutely understandable, right? And there's, I think, particularly maybe a really cool place that bridge builders like yourself, like myself, we have, by notion of having been on the outside, whether it's been imposed on you by the world, whether it's been imposed on you by others, your own community. If you can maintain that center, like you said, you have, in time, you see that as a strength. You see, like, oh, my community is
Mhm.
not seeing what I'm seeing. Now, how do I enable that? And the second thing, to your point, I think power is an emergent property of all human society. You cannot pretend that power does not emerge.
Ooh,
Nothing exists in a vacuum. So the
yes.
question is, how do we enable good leaders with a sense of self-awareness that understand that power can play out in bad ways and good?
Mhm. Well, I mean, the other thing there is to actually you know, interrogate the
Right.
notion of good and
Right.
bad, right? It's like, can we actually be present to what is? And I think that for me as a leader, one of my deepest commitments to the folks I work alongside is that I want to create conditions for their wellness, their connection to family and community, and in doing so, provide opportunity for them to show up more fully as who they are with all of
Mm,
the gifts that they have that come from their lineages, that come from their experiences in life, to then activate in service to our people. And 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 again, that is, that goes back to our teachings of self-resilience. First, know yourself. Take care, know how to dress and clothe and feed yourself and find the water, and then you do that for others. You support them to know the landscape and to do those things for themselves, and then you contribute to the bigger whole. And I think that the best projects, the best work that I get to be a part of, the things that I find myself most proud of are the places where I get to bear witness to folks showing up in their leadership from a position of strength and authority and clarity that only comes when we have this space to explore what that feels
mm,
like in our body, and like, where does it exist and how do I activate that? And the capitalist kind of norms in workspaces don't enable those structures. They are not interested in inviting someone's kind of personal sense of power to come to the forefront, because capitalism relies on a notion of power that is held
mm,
by few, that governs the many, and that looks and feels and behaves a really particular way, right? So folks like me or others, other like Black leaders and racialized leaders and others who are stepping up with the sense of, no, I know who I am. I have a sense of power and authority that means that I don't care about all
mm,
that other noise out there. That is a deeply disturbing and I think a very dangerous thing for folks who are in the relationship to the dominant norm of leadership to bear witness to, because it shakes the very core and foundation of what they think is real and what they think is necessary. I don't believe that you can bear witness to folks who have a sense of authority and power and integrity and not come away being like, wait a second, we can do that? I can behave like that. We can create spaces like that. No one told me. How come I'm not doing that? So I think those kind of rule breakers, the edge walkers, the bridge builders, I feel really fortunate to be in a community of folks who are like, no, no, we're going to show up with all of who we are. And it's a modeling, but I only am doing it because I witnessed other people do it, right? I watched other people, other leaders in my community, men and women in my community. I've witnessed Black and brown women in my community, my global community behave into these ways where I was like, "Oh, damn, that's possible? Okay, I'm gonna try and do that too." I'm gonna step into
But
that
which is,
space.
it's
So
also it's almost it's one of those things where again, when you talk about leadership, you're talking about what do leaders look like? And in a realm of like where you have to personify and productize everything, we're like, "Hey, this is what a fucking leader looks like. Their reader reads these 10 books." Shut up, you don't look like you read
yeah,
at all. And it's sort of like the question is, what are you leading for? What are you leading with? And who are you leading for? Right? That's really ultimately the question here. And so to your point,
yes,
it's I think leadership is almost like a way to interrogate where you are all the time. And are you imposing yourself? And let's be honest, I think people do want to be led sometimes because we are looking to be inspired, but it doesn't have to be top down. It can be bottom up. It can be also horizontal. It could be
yeah.
flat, and so on, right? Mhm.
I want to share with you this book. So this is a book by a dear friend of mine called "Say the Quiet Part Out Loud: Liberate Your Inner Change Maker." It's written
Mm.
by a woman named Bina Patel. Dear friend, I often say I have a like 1-800 called Bina kind of stored in my phone because she just is such a light bringer and a brilliant mind and a dear friend and a sister in this work. I met her back in 2016 and she radicalized my understanding of power and and actually provided an invitation for, you can quit holding your punches. You can quit pulling your punches. Like you can actually throw the punches. but we can be wise
Mm.
about how and when and with whom. And so one of the things that she has said a lot is that the response to fear is not courage,
Mm.
and that really sticks with me quite a lot. That when folks have clarity of purpose, there is kind of like an undeniable certainty that they're headed in a direction, right? If I got purpose, I'm headed that way. Nothing's going to kind of get in the way. If I have to rely on courage, which is a muscle that must be built, and if I have to rely on courage, which looks different for Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks, our courage is a result of having to find ways to exist in a world that is
Mm.
trying to actively kill us. I think that it becomes very quick to burn us out and to deflate us and to de-energize us. But if I have purpose, then that's future oriented, that is grounded, that has some requires some creativity, it requires some possibility, some dreaming into the future. And it also is a requirement of, oh, I don't do this alone. There isn't a singular purpose that I hold. It's what is the like bigger purpose that I'm here in support of my community and my nation, of my son, of the generations to come after me. So yeah, I just want to
That's
offer that
brilliant.
piece up
That's brilliant. So
because
the
I just really
response to fear
love her
is
work.
not courage, it's purpose. That's that's brilliant. I love
Yeah.
that. Because you're right. I think courage is almost a byproduct. You don't act courageous. I think you just have a sense of what's at stake, and by virtue of that, you end up being courageous because you're like, I know what I'm doing this for. And in a world that I do feel a
Yeah.
lot of people, there's an existential crisis. What is all this fucking thing for? We now live in a place of perpetual war, perpetual conflict, disinformation,
Mhm.
fragmentation, depression, all this stuff. These are all things that are purposefully or maybe by virtue of just being at the peak of our civilization where everything starts to change, transition, or crumble, depends on what perspective you're coming from. It's harder to find purpose, harder to find a sense of agency. And the healing may perhaps again
Mhm.
comes from going back to basics. Where do you come from? Who are you with?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Who's with you? Who are you with? Who
Mm,
who are you in service to? And and how do you show up in service to those folks when they're not in the
right.
room? How do you make it visible that I'm here for these people, whether they're in this room or not, even if they're not my people, right? And I think that that is, I think, in this kind of multi-crisis world, this kind of post-apocalyptic reality that we are situated in, I feel deeply, deeply grateful to
Mm,
have a sense of purpose because it means that when things are happening in the world that are devastating and feel hopeless, I know where to turn to. I know where to put my energy. I know where to put my focus. And it's not always going to be on the other side of the world. It's going to be with my healing, with my family, with my nibblings, with the people in my extended community. I feel really fortunate to have that because it feels I have a sense of clarity and a sense of fulfillment in being present in those ways. It helps bring perspective to like, where can I have impact? Where can I be helpful? Where can I bring attention and care and healing to where I have responsibility? And trust deeply that me doing what I can in the space that I can with the relationships that I have, that matters. And I think there are lots of folks who are trying to make sense of a future with the crisis and trying to make sense of a future with what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza. And they can't because the ways in which our society is set up, the ways in which we live today, it means so many folks are kind of disrupted from lands and disrupted from language and disrupted from their own communities. It can feel hard to feel like, oh, I am actually doing something that matters here. I do feel really thankful about being able to bear witness to the deep organizing that is so
mm,
love filled and creative and artistic that's happening. And I just love witnessing the kind of the depths of solidarity and movement building that's happening right now. I think that that's something that gives me hope for the future, and so right now we live in a small city outside of Vancouver. And for years, I've been really just thinking about things like how do I get out of the city and get back to my home? Can I cross the bodies
Mm,
of water from here to my territory if roads don't exist? In the case of an earthquake, who are the people that I'll be like, here's our extra like
mm, mm.
safety backpacks. Here you go. Who do I call on to talk to you about, seeds and food, And then I'm also like, "Oh, and, I have a vehicle, and I'm getting some new tattoos, and I'm grabbing coffee from the place on the around the corner." Like, we have to be willing to live in a world that accepts multiple truths. Like, the world is
That's
ending. It
exactly
always
it.
has been, like,
Right.
in the same way that I'm always dying, And I'm gonna live my life, but be really oriented to, like, where's my purpose? Where do I draw my sense of accountability and
That's
commitment to?
again brilliantly said. I think, this whole thing about both accepting your mortality, like I'm just a person. I'm gonna be worm food or stardust one day, whatever, whatever your orientation is. But with that said, this present moment with my people, with my community, with our struggles and our stories is important, even though I'm going to die.
Yeah.
And as brilliant said, I wanna transition a little bit here, and I think a little to the personal
Sure.
because the story that hopefully you're about to share really speaks to your worldview, which is you, you've been exposed to psychedelics from a very early age, right? The first time you took LSD was at 14, but the one the way you mentioned to me was one of the most important, meaningful experiences with psychedelics early on was with many of the closest people to you, people in your family. Like you talked about one story where you
Mhm.
ate mushrooms for the first
Mhm.
time with your cousin in a bedroom, right? And it was the night after she had eaten mushrooms.
Mhm.
Can you speak to me a little bit about what was it about that experience that made it the most meaningful experience with psychedelics?
I mean, I don't entirely understand where we had the wisdom to agree that we were gonna
Mhm.
try mushrooms, but that we were only going to do it if one of us did it and the other one would kind of watch,
Mm.
take care of the other, and my sister, our first cousins back home are our siblings, and so my sister, she was older than me, so it was like, obviously, you're gonna do it first. You're older than me, and so then I had to watch, and then she had just what appeared to me from the outside a very fun time, and then the next night I did it, and I just really remember that I remembered having moments of having these like big breaths and feeling like I
Mm.
was like breathing the entire room in, and I just remembered that she was beside me, kind of just with her hands on my back and was like, "I'm here, like I'm with you." And I felt like looking back on that and when I reflect on all the other times that I did psychedelic, I was doing them alongside people who were also too young to be doing psychedelics. I was doing
Mm.
it with folks that I was in deep relationship with. And I think that is in part a large part of why my experiences have been predominantly positive, like ones with a lot of learning and growth and sense making connected to them. And it's not lost on me that in the world that we're in, there's more and more relationship or understanding of plant medicine as being our kin, plant medicine as being part of the kind of human existence on this planet, that we see them as family, as teachers, as ways to come, ways of being in ceremony. It makes sense to me that even from the very beginning of my own psychedelics use, it was like that. A lot of finding ways to bring some beauty and ceremony into those moments, but also always with people who I deeply trusted. And in fact, the only time that I had an awful mushroom experience was in an environment where I was definitely not, it would not have been a safe space. And so, I got like super sick. My other sister like loves to remind me about how she had to take care of me and clean me up. But I think that to me was a massive lesson very early on of, oh,
Mm.
there's places and spaces where this is not wise. And there are places that are safer and wiser for me to be in. And again, really fortunate to have had that experience at a young age and therefore also be able to share that with friends and with others to be like, like maybe think differently about how and when you're using it, using different kinds of drugs. Yeah, the being in relationship, giving lots of thinking to kind of the setting of places, my own mindset, I think have been really crucial
Do you
to
feel,
my experiences.
I think of as I'm also learning about how, indigenous communities where some of these medicines were indigenous, their exposure is one thing, but also stories of different communities across the world, through wary travelers or through people who've gone out and, twisted hairs who've gone out and brought these medicines home. Is there a do you think in your own community, in the communities that you're exposed to, do you think there's a role for medicines that you grew up with versus medicines that were brought to you, medicines that you had to go out and find? Is it seen differently? Should it be seen differently?
Hmm. I think that's a really great question, but I don't know that I've got the best wisdom on it because I don't know much about the specific varieties of
Mm.
psychedelic mushrooms that grow in my region, for example. I have no clue. I just use whatever the dude from out of town brought and sold, That's what you did. You hung out around the community hall and someone showed up and they had LSD or mushrooms and you were like, "Okay, I'm gonna try these things." I do feel like the wisdom that I've gained from bearing witness to others and hearing from others, especially, good humans like Kim Haxton, that being able to be in a relationship to the land where the medicine comes from, I think is incredibly powerful. I think if that's something that's available to you, I think that's a fucking gift. But I also know that indigenous peoples, we were travelers. My own people,
Mm.
Sequem, we're the spread out people. Like our territory is a large territory. We wandered about, And so I think we always had
Mhm.
relationships of trade and commerce over vast, territories in the world. So I think there is something as well about the times where medicine shows up for you. It may not be in the lands where that medicine is cultivated and grown and tended to and has been stewarded, but if you're fortunate enough to be in a relationship with someone who has been, mentored and educated or apprenticed with those indigenous peoples and those knowledges, that's such a beautiful gift. And I think, I hope that the psychedelics community recognizes that and actually also knows that the best likelihood, the best pathway for legalization, the best pathway for deepening our collective understanding and collective consciousness is going to
Mhm.
come by safeguarding indigenous people's lands and their rights and their access to their medicine. That's the thing that is most key in all of it. And so where I've seen medicines show up and do beautiful work, transformative work in communities with folks who have PTSD, with folks who have deep depression, it's been the places where there's a relationship
Mm.
to land and language and place, and that there's something beautiful that's happening there that I think is being catalyzed because of the relationship to place that doesn't happen if you're like, just being
I think that's a
unthinking
really good
about
point.
and
I
relationship to
also think
place.
about, there's there's the baselining that you have to do, right? For example, if you're traumatized, if you're hurting, if you're depressed, you cannot think about flying. You have to come first to ground, from being underground to ground, right? Come to baseline. Come to be
Mhm.
a place where
Yeah.
you have a sense of self. These trauma takes away your sense of agency.
Yes.
So medicines can come to that, but I think beyond that, it is very hard to soar, to fly, to find purpose, to find agency without that container. Without a container that has a sense, again, like you were saying,
Mhm.
a sense of place, a sense of history, a sense of this sort of a legacy that this
Mhm.
container has been built through time,
Yeah.
through experiences. It's been created.
Yes.
It's emerged naturally through time, and I think this is where a lot of the world, a lot of the psychedelic world, a lot of the people find themselves in precarious places because Eat on our fucking mushrooms, but then
You
what?
know, yeah, and, there's I think the biggest business actually won't be in the distribution of
Mhm.
psychedelics. It's
Mhm.
gonna be in the integration. It's gonna be in sense making because folks who do not come from lineages, folks who do not have a sense of purpose and place and language and land, they are going to struggle to, I believe, to do the integration necessary to do healing and evolutionary work. I think yeah, I just think that's the thing. I think that I mean, I feel kind of shitty saying it, but I mean, even when I think about, oh, what are the gifts that I have to offer in this sector? That's the thing that I think about. I'm like, oh,
Mm.
I'm pretty blessed with the
Mm.
inability to help people make sense of shit. And that's an easy thing for me because I have this grounding. Is there a gift or an offering that I can have, and support others to move through? Yeah, probably. There's like different ways I can show up. But when I look broadly at folks who are doing this work and the places where I find myself
Mm.
being like, ooh, like I'm a little worried for
Yeah.
folks. It's in the integration work. And I don't believe that Western science and kind of Western psychologies and therapies are the answer to integration. Because if those things are the answers, we wouldn't be trying to figure this stuff out now. So I think that even those practices are evolving, and I'm very thankful and glad for that. We're seeing an increase in recognition of the power of somatic healing practices, et cetera. But I do think that, the sense making work is really important. And I think that it is often
I totally agree with
undervalued and
you,
it's
and I think,
undertrained.
part of the reason why integration is difficult, but also not often focused on in the realm of, like, consumerism is because it's every day. It's constant. It's work. It's not just
Yes.
you can't be a bliss junkie and enjoy integration. Bliss junkie is about finding those quick, it's sort of like there's the other part of it, which is like,
Yeah.
oh, here, eat these mushrooms so you can alleviate your anxiety, so you can go back to the shit job that you hate, working with the people you don't like. It's not about that, right? It's
Yeah. That is
yeah,
like a
exactly.
medication for numbing, right? That's like, this
Yeah,
is a solution to get through the days versus this is a
yeah.
medicine to
And the point
support my
maybe is that you
healing
don't
and
need the medicine at the
well-being.
end of the day, in the sense that you will
Yeah.
now have a community that is the medicine. I think that's
Yes.
what we're trying to get into, the sort of sense of connection with nature, with others, and so on.
Yes.
We've touched a lot on leadership, but in the last part of the podcast, Chris, I want to talk a little bit about, what is the circle doing? And I think what I really love about what you folks are building and the agenda here is competency building, capacity building, but ultimately you talk a lot about you talk about two things. One is, dialogue and civic engagement, but the second thing is redistribution of wealth, but not in the sort of like using political power, but actually convincing those with money to give and enable others who don't have the means. I want to hear a little about what that mission is
Yeah.
and what that means to
And,
you.
you know, yeah, I mean, so the work of the circle is really to support what we call settler philanthropy, which is philanthropy that's been built on the lands and backs of Indigenous peoples. That we work to support settler philanthropy with technical and relational skill building in order to influence a
Mm.
redistribution of wealth back to where it belongs. And so, in doing so, our invitation to funders, to family foundations, to others is not, let us help you find an organization that fits your mission and mandate and purpose. It is, let us help you find an Indigenous organization who can, make best use of those dollars for the actualization of their rights and for the desires that they have in community, which you may never understand, which context and cultural competency you may never
Mhm.
understand the depths of because you're not of those places, but you can trust in the wisdom of these ancient places and people and communities to know what's best for themselves and to mobilize the dollars and
Mm.
to step out of the way and let people do their good work. So redistribution of wealth is also about acknowledging that actually Indigenous peoples globally have a relationship to wealth redistribution practices and laws and teachings that that are so well understood and that the settler philanthropic sector could actually learn a lot from. What does true wealth and abundance mean? And how do we conceptualize it so that it's actually about being in a
Mm.
quality of relationship and not transaction? And yeah, so I feel really
What
glad to
is
be in
what
that
is your
work.
hope and aspiration for the circle's agenda? And I mean, both from a personal level, but also what do you hope to achieve with the circle?
I hope that the circle continues to build a member network that sees that there's so much possibility for how redistribution of wealth can happen. That folks continue to be like more and more creative about how to transfer power and decision making and wealth to Indigenous peoples and communities for their solutions, for their innovation, for their ventures, whatever those ventures may be. And then the other piece is what I hope for the settler philanthropic sector is I hope that they recognize that we're in a moment in the world whereby they could be making history if they choose to behave differently. And part of that behaving differently is coming to account for how their wealth was built and where it actually belongs.
Mm.
You know, whose land, whose backs is it built on, and how do you actually
Do you
get
find
that
that,
wealth
you
back
know, I
to
mean,
people?
on one hand, you can see that a conversation like this, if you're not in the right room, not using the right tone, the right language, could be very, let's just say, polarizing or antagonizing. Do you feel like you, from your perspective, being the bridge builder, being the twisted hair, being the sort of the outsider rebellious person who is now part of, for the lack of a better word, the establishment in your being the man, in your own words, do you feel like that you have a special vantage point? And I ask that particularly as we sort of reach the last few minutes. What can emerging leaders, what can other people in your community learn from you? What do you advise them? What do you advise other, you know, outsiders, quote unquote, who want to engage? What special vantage point can you offer them? It's a very convoluted question, I know.
I think, you know what? I think what matters, or at least what has worked for me, is that I worked really
Mm.
hard to cultivate a daily practice for reflection and sense making and discernment. And I think that that is really essential, like understanding oneself and being deeply committed to healing traumas and to maintaining a sense of hope and optimism for the future is not easy work, but it's needed in the world that we're in. The other thing is that for those folks who have the privilege of unbroken or rebuilding connection to their homelands and their territories and to their language and to their communities, recognize those not as just places for you to learn and take from, but as places where you can build your accountabilities and demonstrate your commitment to making this world a different place. And then the other piece is just that I think for folks in this particular community who are engaged in the psychedelics community, I think, you know, it becomes really essential that folks
Mm.
understand Indigenous rights and how it is that they can be, allies in enabling the assertion of Indigenous rights as this movement towards psychedelic
Beautiful. Chris,
legalization
I just want to
moves
say that
forward.
this is such an immensely enjoyable conversation. I'm so grateful to you for, being in my life, for being a friend, but also sharing such crazy wisdom with us. For me, like it's really amazing to know people who are both rebellious in nature, but also have a deep sense of community and understanding where they fit in the world. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was delightful. I feel like we could spend hours talking, and I'm glad that we get to.
This podcast was brought to life with the help of Carolyn Tripp on art and design. Thanks so much for listening to Minority Trip Report. If you're learning from or enjoying the podcast, please subscribe to MTR on YouTube at Minority Trip Report and follow us on Instagram at Minority Trip. It's a zero cost way to support us and help us spread the word. Please also sign up with your email for new episode announcements, events, as well as our forthcoming newsletter. I'm your host, Raj Suraj. See you next time.